All right, now I'm going to admit all. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to wait another minute or two for some more people to join. All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mitchell Noble. I'm the Acting Director of Planning and Infrastructure here at Willoughby City Council. And we're here to talk to you tonight about the state government's low and mid-rise housing reforms. Now, these were introduced by the government on the 28th of February. We appreciate they're relatively new and there are lots of people trying to understand the impact of the reforms. They're quite complex, and we've gone over the information and developed our own understanding of what that means for Willoughby City Council and our residents and businesses here, and we'd like to talk to you about that tonight. We're going to try and explain it to you as simply as we can, and we have lots of time at the end of the session for a Q&A session. So I'll talk to you in a moment about some housekeeping matters. But to start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which Darla and I are on today, which is the land of the Cammeraygal people, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. We have a fair bit of information to present to you, probably about 30 minutes before we go into our Q&A session. And as I mentioned, there'll be lots of time for questions. So can I ask that you please hold your questions to the end of the session? What we'll be doing is inviting you to either put your hand up so that I can pick you out and ask your question, and you can turn your video on, your mic on, and talk to us. Or you can post your question in the chat. There's the Q&A section here. I want to introduce you to Dylan Govender, who's with me this evening. Dylan's our acting head of planning here and has been over the information and the legislation produced by the government, and we're going to explain it to you shortly. One thing I want to stress to you from the outset is that these are not pieces of legislation and not changes introduced by Willoughby City Council. We're just giving you an explanation of it. They're actually changes that have been proposed by and introduced by the state government. And so our role here tonight is to explain their work. We're going to be recording this session. So the recording is now live. This is to help us take notes of the meeting, but also for those who couldn't join us tonight, they can come on when we post this later on our website to understand some of the discussion to save us from doing some further sessions. What I'll do now is just share my presentation and go through a few slides before I hand over to Dylan. Give me one moment, please. So the agenda for tonight's presentation is to talk to you about the reforms themselves, where they apply in Willoughby. So we'll show you a map and indicate where the changes are happening. We'll talk to you about what they allow in terms of the types of new development that can occur on the land. And then, as I mentioned, we'll go through the question and answer session. And what we're trying to do is provide a high-level summary, really, about the low and mid-rise reforms and convey to you our understanding of those controls. Really important for us all to understand that Dylan and I are town planners, we're not lawyers. So it shouldn't be taken as legal advice. We can't go into specific detail. So, if you've got questions about particular sites, that'll be pretty tricky for us to answer tonight. So, you can seek other advice if you want more detailed advice. So would be appreciated if you can make sure your questions are pitched appropriately. And contextually, we are in a time of significant change for the New South Wales planning system. There have been so many changes recently. We are talking about a specific change, the most recent change, which happened in February, called the low and mid-rise housing reforms. There were other changes you might be aware of. Dating back to 2023, Council made its new local environmental plan, which had lots of capacity for additional homes and jobs throughout Willoughby. So we're not talking about those changes. We are not talking about the infill affordable housing changes, which allowed an extra 30% or up to 30% height and density on top of new developments that have infill affordable housing. And we're not talking about the TODs, or the transit-oriented development reforms, excuse me, that happened in November 2024. The focus will be low and mid-rise housing. So to begin, I wanted to share with you our distillation at a very high level of what's happening through these particular reforms. And essentially what is occurring is that these reforms override council's own local planning controls, excuse me, to allow more duplexes on smaller lots across most of the local government area. And that includes heritage conservation areas. There'll be more terraces, townhouses, villa developments, and two-storey residential flats in low density areas. And there'll be taller and denser apartments and mixed-use development in the R3 medium density zones that are within 800 metres of stations and local centres. And again, these are changes that are quite broad. They won't be happening overnight. They're not instantaneous changes in terms of the construction impact, or we're not going to see all of this development occur at once. This is a broad capacity change that is likely to mean the land and the changes that we show you this evening are going to happen over a number of years. It's not all going to happen overnight. So I want to hand over to Dylan Govender now, our Acting Head of Planning, to take you through the rest of the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for making some time. You've heard the phrase low and mid-rise housing. We've mentioned it a few times tonight, and you'll see it in the reforms. What does that mean? What exactly are we talking about when we talk about low and mid-rise housing? The low-rise housing we're talking about is dual occupancy, so that's side-by-side, two dwellings on one lot. And there are provisions that allow them, once they're built, to then be subdivided into two separate lots, but it's that side-by-side, two dwellings form of housing. We're talking about terrace housing, and again, side by side, but now more than two houses, attached generally, side by side along a single frontage, usually built on a single lot and then subdivided later. And then we're talking about manor houses. Now, manor houses, the name probably hides what they really are. We're talking about multiple dwellings on a two-storey building. It's like a two-storey walk-up flat building, so usually 3-4 dwellings within one two-storey building. So that's manor houses, and they're the low rise in the low and mid-rise. The mid-rise in that low and mid-rise phrase are 3-storey flat buildings and 4 to 6-storey flat buildings, and we're talking about unit blocks of that sort of size. Next slide, please. So where do these reforms apply? We've talked about the types of housing that they talk about and permit. Where do they permit them? The reforms talk about a number of locations in the Willoughby LGA or affecting the Willoughby LGA. Roseville Station, now the station's not within our LGA, but the area around it is, and so there's an area of our LGA affected. Chatswood Town Centre, Artarmon Station, Northbridge Town Centre, St Leonard Station, and Crow's Nest Station. And we're talking about the area 800 metres around those locations, and I'll get into a bit more detail about that in a moment. You'll notice there's a difference here. Some of these are stations, some of these are centres. Where the station is listed, we're talking about the station entry points and 800 metres walking distance around those station entry points. In the centres, you may be able to make out on this map, there's a purple line. That purple line is the centre boundary that the state government has implemented. There is a separate map that they provide that confirms where that line is located, and it's 800 metres walking distance from that line. So that's where they apply. Next slide, please. I mentioned the 800 metre distances, specifically 800 metre walking distance. How is that measured? And I'm sure many of you might have questions around, am I in or out of that 800 metres? You might have even seen that the state government's released an indicative map that colours areas, and some of the maps we've taken and provided in our slides are taken from that indicative map. And it colours areas that are roughly within an 800 metre walking distance. Now, I say roughly, and I mentioned the map that's produced is indicative only, because the way it works is the 800 metres will need to be calculated and assessed as part of the application. So the state government and nor council, we won't be pre-approving a radius or publishing a map that is a simple reference point. Unfortunately, the way the legislation is worded and the way it was made is that it provides a definition of walking distance, and then it applies the changes, it applies what it's allowing, and we'll go through the detail of that in a moment as well, to this 800 metre walking distance, and in some cases 400 metre walking distance. You can see there the definition of walking distance that they've provided, the shortest distance between 2 points measured along a route that may be safely walked by a pedestrian using, as far as reasonably practical, public footpaths and pedestrian crossings. And in addition to that definition, there's some case law and some legal cases around development approvals around walking distance that no doubt will come to bear as well. But crucially, you'll see safely walked there, and that's really important, particularly for our LGA and particularly for locations like Chatswood and Artarmon, Northbridge, all of the locations on that list really, where there are main roads and other infrastructure that can't simply be traversed in a straight line from a station entrance or from the edge of those town centres. So for example, crossing the Pacific Highway, you're not going to be able to draw a straight line from the edge of the centre to your property to calculate that 800 or 400 metres. You may need to create a bit of a zigzag as you find the safest, or a safe, I should say, as you find a safe crossing point for that highway. And the distance to that safe crossing point might vary. So you need to make sure you're calculating it from safe walking distance. And if you're in doubt, the way I'd suggest you go about determining where the areas or where particular sites are in or out, you're welcome to start with that indicative map from the department. But again, I wouldn't take that as gospel. That's indicative only. From there, I'd look at things like Google Maps provides a bit of a walking distance. There are other maps out there where you can map 2 points. And I'd look at the station, look at the edge of those centres and map a walking distance. It's to the edge of your lot. So you don't need to calculate it to your current door or to where the front door is going to be proposed. You calculate it to the edge of the lot you're trying to assess against. Calculate a rough walking distance, and that'll give you a rough guide. Again, rough guide only. If you are looking to proceed with a development application, I'd encourage this to be the first thing you ask of a planner when you engage a planner to help you with that development application. And it is a difficult, complicated process to get through a development application for these types of developments. There's a level of information that's going to be required, and you will need some professionals to help you with that. This should be the first question you ask of them. Can you confirm that distance and confirm for me that the property in question is within, before I proceed with paying a further money to develop the application, simply get this confirmed as the first port of call. Next slide. And again, just reiterating, so the map that the state government's provided is indicative only. And in addition to that walking distance issue, there are some other exemptions. So if you are a heritage item, so that is a specific building listed, or a specific lot listed as a single lot or building in our heritage list, these reforms don't take effect on those properties. If you're in bushfire prone land, it doesn't take effect in those properties. If you're already subject to the Crow's Nest Transit Oriented Development Area in our LGA, which is limited, there's one site down near St Leonard's Station, the Herbert Street site next to the hospital there, that's impacted by the transit oriented development, then these reforms don't apply in those TOD areas either. So there are some other exemptions, and as I said, this map is indicative. And as Mitch mentioned, we're talking in very broad terms here. There are a whole bunch of other things that you'll need to go through to make sure that application can be assessed and subsequently potentially approved. Now I'll switch from the distances and the locations for a moment now and talk about the types. If you have more questions about that, we've got some questions at the end. But again, I just reiterate, we're not going to be in a position to confirm for you specific locations. There is a bit of work you'll need to do through those methods I mentioned to potentially identify if you're in or out of those radiuses. Moving now to the back to those types. So in these 800 metre radiuses, what am I allowed to do? It depends on the type of development we're talking about, and it does depend, as I mentioned and alluded to, in addition to the 800 radius, there's also a 400, which we'll get to in a moment. Let's start at the lower end of the scale, dual occupancies. So if you are in an R2 low density zone within 800 metres of one of those listed centres, so again, I mentioned those listed centres being Roseville, Chatswood, Northbridge, Artarmon, St Leonard's, Crow's Nest, and again, in the cases of Roseville, Artarmon, St Leonard's and Crow's Nest, we're talking about the stations. With Chatswood and Northbridge, we're talking about the centres. If I'm 800 metres of those locations and I'm in an R2 low density zone, then these controls apply. And if I satisfy these controls, then I can apply for a duplex on that lot. So if I have a minimum lot size of 450 square metres, a minimum frontage of 12 metres, if the proposal for the duplex is at a maximum of 9.5 metres, so the proposed duplex has to stay at or below 9.5 metres. If the floor space I'm providing is at a ratio of 6.65 to 1. And so what that means, floor space ratio, refers to the amount of area within the building as compared to the size of my lot. So the 1 in that ratio is the square metres of my lot. The 0.65 is how much area is allowed to be in the building that's proposed. So for a duplex under the state legislation, it's a ratio of 0.65 to 1. And these applications will be permitted in heritage conservation areas where they are within 800 metres and in an R2 low density zone. Now, you can see there's another column with council controls. These council controls are the controls council previously had and remain in place for development applications in R2 low density areas. So as you can see, council previously permitted duplexes on slightly larger lots, larger minimum frontages, slightly lower height, slightly lower floor space ratio, and we did not permit them in the heritage conservation areas. Under these reforms, you'll see within 800 metres, more lots are now able to apply for duplexes. And I say apply, that's the other thing to note here. This is simply the set of criteria that allows you to lodge a development application. That application still needs to be assessed. And just because you tick these measurements and these locations, that doesn't mean you are guaranteed an approval. You will still need to address a whole range of design criteria, and I'll speak briefly to those later. Again, we don't have the time tonight to go through everything. We're just providing you a high level. So we'll go through these first barrier controls, if you will, and then I'll allude to those design guides later, and you'll be able to refer to them at your own leisure. The slightly larger developments now, moving up from duplexes, manor houses and terraces. And you'll recall when I say manor house, it's a single building with sort of 3 to 4 usually units within that single 2-story building. Terraces, you might be familiar with them. They're more plentiful in other areas of Sydney, but there are a few around Willoughby, and that's the side-by-side dwellings, 3, 4 terraces, sometimes more side by side. As you can see, Council previously only permitted those forms in the R3 zones. We didn't have a minimum lot size. We had a minimum frontage control, so you needed to have a 27 metre long at the front property. We had height controls, and they differed depending on the specific R3 zone in question. And they ranged between 8.5 metres and 12 metres. The floor space ratio controls, again, varying location to location in our LGA, were 0.7 to 1 and 1 to 1. But now, after the reforms, these are now permitted not just in the R3 zone, but also in R2 zones, in R4 zones, as well as the R3 zones, within 800 metres walking distance of those listed centres, and that also includes in the heritage conservation areas within those centres. The minimum lot size for manor houses and multi-dwelling houses. Now, multi-dwelling houses, if you think about a villa house, so maybe it might be a single dwelling or a duplex at the front with little units behind it. You can do something like that on a 600 square metre lot. If you're talking about terraces, those terrace houses side by side, you need a 500 square metre lot. So if you're in 800 metres walking distance of the listed centre, those are your minimum lot sizes. The minimum frontages, manor houses and multi-dwelling houses, 12 metre frontage. For terrace houses, 18 metre frontages. The height, similarly 9.5 metres. And again, remembering we're talking about what's termed low rise, and that's why the 9.5 metre height limit applies there. And for floor space ratios for manor houses and multi-dwelling, we're talking 0.8 to 1 and terraces 0.7 to 1. And again, I reiterate, just because you might tick those lot size boxes and those location boxes, that doesn't mean you're going to get an approval. You will still need to comply with a whole range of other controls that relate to things like parking, landscaping, and so on. And so we would still need to assess the application. These are just the base level description of the sorts of land you will need to be able to put an application together for assessment. Next slide. Now we move up to the mid-rise. And so we're talking those sort of flat buildings and shop top housing developments in those mid-rise, at the mid-rise scale. And this is where there's some differences between the 800 and 400 metre radiuses. I'll go through them. This information will be available on the website. However, I'd encourage you, if you are interested in reiterating some of this, the state government's website is the best place and the source of truth for this information. So I'd encourage you to go have a look at their low and mid-rise site. For flat buildings and shop top houses, again, you can see council had some things permitted, some things prohibited. So we didn't allow this type of development in any of our R2 zones. We did allow this sort of development in R3 and R4 zones. We didn't have a minimum lot size for that. We didn't have anything in the R2 zones, obviously, because they were prohibited. In the R3 and R4 zones, you did need a lot with a 27 metre frontage. The height varied, so we permitted 8.5 to 12 metres in the R3 zones, 12 to 36 in the R4 zones, again, depending on your specific location in the LGA. And the floor space ratios varied 0.7 to 1 to 1 to 1 for the R3, 1.5 to 1 to 2 to 1 in the R4, again, depending on exactly where you are within the LGA. But now that the reforms apply, within those 800 metres, These forms are permitted in R2, R3 and R4 zones. You will need a minimum lot size of 500 square metres in the R2 zone. In the R3 and R4 zone, there is no minimum lot size requirement. In the R2 zone, you will need a lot with a minimum frontage of 12 metres. In the R3 and R4 zone, no minimum applies. In the R2 zone, the maximum height remains 9.5 metres. So what that means is that in the end, you're going to get similar sorts of development to that manor house form that I'd mentioned before, because the height limit remains 9.5 metres. And you've got below you can see there's an FSR of 0.8 to 1 in the R2 zone. So those are the limits on how much of a building you can construct. And in the R2 zone, it's still quite limited. In the R3s and R4 zones, if you are within 400 metres of one of those centres, so you're a bit closer to those centres, you can build a flat building up to about 6 stories, 22 metres, and a shop top housing development up to 7 stories, about 24 metres. Now, what's the difference? What do I mean when I say shop top housing? If you think about a multi-story building, again, you think 6, 7 stories, where the ground floor has some mixed retail, maybe some services or some office development, basically non-residential commercial development types. So some shops at the bottom with some houses on top. That's what I mean when I say shop top housing, and that's what the controls here allow for. So if you've got a development with some commercial on the ground floor, within that 400 metre radius of one of those listed centres, you can do a shop top housing development up to 7 stories, 24 metres. Now, if you're in the outer ring, that 400 to 800 metre zone, in an R3 or R4 zone, the limit goes down a bit to 4 stories, about 17.5 metres. For the floor space ratios, if you're in that inner ring, 400 metres, R3 and R4 zones, the maximum floor space ratio is 2.2 to 1. If you're in that outer ring, 400 metres to 800 metres, R3 and R4 zones, the maximum FSR is 1.5 to 1. And again, there are various design controls that apply above and beyond this. These are simply the barriers to allow an application in the first instance. Next slide, please. As I've mentioned throughout, there's a whole range of other design controls that apply here. So that list of heights, floor space ratios, frontages, and lot sizes is essentially the barrier for entry. They're the criteria that allow you to make an application in the first instance. That application needs to satisfy a whole range of other controls. There's a tree canopy guide that was released with these reforms, and that includes controls around tree replacement, landscaped areas and so on that also apply. Council's development control plan applies where there is no inconsistency with any state guidelines. So where there's a state guideline, either in that tree canopy guide or in the apartment design guide, the state guidelines prevail. But where there is no guideline and council has implemented one, the application will be assessed against the development control plan. That's going to be particularly important in heritage conservation areas, where we have a range of specific criteria in the heritage conservation areas that will need to be addressed by any application and may significantly limit the types of applications that will be able to be approved. So while the reforms will allow DAs now to be lodged, they will still be measured against the design criteria. And as I mentioned, in those heritage conservation areas, we have specific development control plans relating to them that have quite specific controls. And where they are not overlapping or inconsistent with the state controls, we will be able to apply them, and that may be an important consideration when you're thinking about what may or may not be permitted on land in those conservation areas. For flat buildings, you've also got the apartment design guide, which has a range of other specifications. And that's those three that we've pictured there aren't the be all end all. There's a whole range of other things that apply when you're doing a development application. You need to think about your Australian standards, your building codes and so on for the types of building you're proposing, and those will remain things that need to be assessed as part of your application. That's the general summary that we're able to provide for you. Again, as I mentioned, these slides and some other information is available on our website, but I'd also encourage you to have a look at the State Government Low and Mid-Rise website, which again remains the source of truth for this information, being a state government reform. We've done our best to interpret that as best we can for our context, but the State Government reform site is the best place to start. And we'll open it up for some questions. I'll hand back to Mitch to arrange that. We've got both facility for questions to be posted as well as asked verbally, and we'll do our best to answer. Again, I just reiterate, we're not going to be able to give individual advice about specific proposals or specific lots. We'll really just do our best to clarify what's permitted at that higher level. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dylan. And we're going to go to some questions now. We will try and do a mix of whatever you post in the Q&A and raised hands. Rita, I can see you've got some questions. So the process will be I will unmute you and turn your and ask whether you can turn your video on and you can ask your question. So I will just do that now for you, Rita. And if you unmute, you can ask your question. How are we doing, Rita? Can you press the unmute button? Oh, looks like you've got it. There you go.
Yep.
How are you doing? What's your question?
Hi. All the other areas like Roseville, Tarman, St Leonard's, Crow's Nest, they're all 800 metres within the station. Why is Chatswood 800 metres from the CBD?
So both Chatswood and Northbridge are identified as centres rather than stations. In Northbridge case, there isn't a station there, though, so it's a little bit more obvious. Why, in the case of Chatswood, did the department choose to establish a radius from the centre rather than the station? Look, I can't speak for that with any complete certainty. It wasn't council's decision as such, but from the discussions we'd had with the department in the lead up to these reforms and based on the information they've provided about their rationale, it's about being able to get to the sorts of services available in a centre. In the cases of some of the centres, they felt comfortable to provide a line and a map where they were comfortable to allow this extra density within those walking distances. In those areas where they weren't as comfortable to provide that line, they've used the station entrances. So while I can't speak to the full rationale, my understanding is the state government was basically looking to provide this sort of housing within accessible locations to the sorts of services needed to support it. They were looking for centres that could handle this sort of development in their view. And in the cases of some of those centres, they were comfortable to provide an area. In other cases, they deferred to the location of the station.
So are we able to argue that at all? Or is that...
No, the 800 metres and the locations and the need to calculate that as walking distance, that's now the setting, and that's what we will assess against. So it's not a variable matter. It's a matter of us measuring from where they've identified that where they've identified those centre lines, and in the cases of the stations, it's legislated as being from the station entrance.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Rita. I want to go now to Lucy. I'm just going to allow Mike. Lucy, if you unmute, you should be able to speak to us.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep, we've got you, Lucy. What's your question?
On the state website, dual occupancy, it says 2 dwellings on one lot permissibility changes permitted in R2 zones applies statewide, not only within low and mid-rise housing area. So my understanding for state website, it's dual, it's permitted in any R2 zones, not only 800-meter walking distance if it meets 450 and 12-meter frontage. However, on the PPT just shown just now, it still says dual at Willoughby. It should be 800-meter walking distance.
Yes, I can clarify for you. So the reforms were announced in 2 stages, and in stage 2, the most recent changes, this is where the reforms apply within the 800 metres. The stage 1 reforms, which occurred some months ago now, introduced dual occupancies into R2 zones more generally where they were not already permitted. Where dual occupancies were already allowed in R2 zones, those reforms pick up the minimum lot sizes that were in council's LEPs. So in Willoughby's case, council did allow, and as I showed on the slide, council controls did allow dual occupancies in our R2 zone already at minimum lot sizes of 700 square metres for attached, 900 square metres for detached, with minimum frontages of 15 metres. This reform simply picks up that existing permissibility. It doesn't extend it at all. So the minimum lot sizes outside the 800 metre radiuses, council's minimum lot sizes and frontages still apply. The inside the 800 square metre radiuses, the state government reforms, their minimum lot sizes apply.
Thank you for your question. We're going to go now to Bo Wei Zhao. I will allow Mike. If you unmute now, you should be able to speak to us.
Hi, thank you, Mitchell Dillon. I had a quick question around how the rules of the new rules interact with existing council rules. Taking an example around the dual occupancy with a 12-meter wide, that's a new requirement. I understand there was a rule in from the Willoughby Council around allowing duplexes in those cases if you have rear or side access. Now with the new set of rules, is it just you can build duplexes without those side access or rear accesses, or you still have to comply with these other rules, of which that side or rear access is one of them?
So you do still need to comply with all the relevant design rules. As I said, what we've done is just really summarize them at a high level. Look, I appreciate there are a whole range of complexities and different scenarios that determine what will apply in particular cases. And look, unfortunately, I don't have the capacity to answer all of those detailed questions here. So broadly speaking, though, yes, you do need to go through the other design rules that apply because, as I said, these are just the sort of base level summary headlines. You need to go through the other individual design constraints to figure out how they apply specifically. I appreciate it's a little bit complicated. I know, when we made our submission to the department, when they exhibited these changes, one of the points we made is, planning's already a very complicated area, and we'd really encourage changes that help simplify things rather than complicate them. However, these changes are really a sideways step in that regard, picking up a number of existing complexities. So that complexity is still there. So I can't give you a simple quick answer here, other than to say, yes, you still need to check those more detailed design constraints to make sure you've got the exact right frontage as it applies in your case. And again, I should flag, just with all of this advice, as Mitch mentioned, we're not lawyers. We've done our best to interpret the legislation and provide that summary here. We're doing our best to be accurate in that regard, but you are encouraged to seek your own advice and test what we're providing here against the source of truth, being the state government legislation.
Thank you, really helpful.
Thank you very much for your question. We're going to go over to the Q&A section now where we've got some questions. Thank you for your patience for those that have put forward a question earlier. Anna asks, how do you know what zone you fall into?
Good question. So the zones, so whether you're an R2, R3 or R4 zone, those have been in place for some time. They're zones that have been in Council's local environmental plan. It's called Council's LEP, and there are a whole bunch of maps associated with that LEP document, which maps the land that those zones apply to. This reform doesn't change any of those zones, so those locations stay the same. So if you have a look at what's called Council's, so Willoughby LEP, it's called a local environmental plan, and if you have a little click on the maps that are associated with that, you'll see some zoning maps, some land use zoning maps, and that maps where the zones apply. In Willoughby's case, all of our maps are on the state government's spatial viewer. So if you go to the Department of Planning website and have a look for their spatial viewer, the Willoughby zoning's there. Again, I'd encourage you to go have a look if you Google something like Willoughby Local Environmental Plan, you'll be able to find where the zone lines are.
Thank you. Ryan asks, if a property is located in an R3 zone, are projects permitted under R2 zoning regulations also allowed?
So if you're in an R3 zone, does it pick up the R2 permissibility as well? That is a good question. If I remember correctly, and just sort of glancing over at my notes, for dual occupancies, are dual occupancies permitted in the R3, R4 zone would be the crux of that question. I have to admit I'd need to double check that. I don't know offhand. I'd interpreted it to be permissible in the R2 zone, but I'd need to double check that. Certainly, it is a concern we had under our council controls. We zoned R3 and R4 zoned areas as areas where we would really be wanting to seek those higher densities to make sure we've got adequate housing supply and it's in locations that can handle it. We don't like to see development applications that underdevelop land that would otherwise be able to handle more homes, particularly given the housing crisis we're in. But I have to admit, offhand, I don't know for sure off the top of my head. You'd need to check the legislation which specifies which zones the controls apply. Apologies, I don't know the one off the top of my head is the short answer.
That's right. Thank you, Dylan. I'll grab one now from Jay in the text chat, and then I'll go back over to Hans. So in heritage conservation areas, Jay asks, will council have additional rules or controls? If yes, when will council publish the new policies or rules?
So as I mentioned, there are a range of other controls that apply. They are already available and published. So if you have a look at Council's Development Control Plan, for example, that contains a whole range of rules. There's multiple components to that document, not all of which apply. Some of them relate to commercial developments in other zones. Some of them are specifically related to our heritage conservation areas. Some of them relate more generally to residential development. So they're already published and available. The guide that relates to the landscape provisions and the tree planting requirements under these reforms is already published and available on the department website as well. So there are a range of other controls, as I alluded to, and that is all in the development control plan.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Vanessa Whedon. Vanessa, if you unmute, you should be able to talk to us now.
Hi, thank you. Question. Council's LEP currently has a height limitation of 5.7 metres for a second dwelling in dual occupancy. Can you confirm that this new planning rule for houses within the 800 metre radius will override that and allow a 9.5 metre height? And my second part of my question is, will council be amending its LEP to clarify all of this and bring it in alignment with the stage 2 housing reforms?
So under the first question, sorry, I might be unclear. Did you mean, as I mentioned, there is a council control for dual ocs 8.5 metres. That is indeed, as I mentioned, within 800 metres of the stations. Now, under these reforms, you can apply up to 9.5 metres. So that's the answer to that first question, if I've understood it correctly. As for the second question, will Council be amending its LEP to bring it into line with these? No, the intention is not to make any amendments to Council's LEP, noting that, again, the reforms with their minimum lot sizes and the heights, as we understand it, apply and override our minimum lot sizes and controls within those 800 metre areas. Outside the 800 metre area, in the R2 low density area, Council's dual occupancy controls are still taken up by the reforms in certain ways. So it's important that we maintain them as they are.
Thanks for your question, Vanessa. Our next question is from Arash. You should be able to speak to us now if you unmute, Arash.
Hi, I have a question about the new regulation. How do we justify the regulation if my neighbor can build a duplex in 450 square meter block, but I need 700 square meter as for instance, 812 meters walking distance of the town centre?
So again, the rationale that the state government provided for establishing that distance and that limitation was setting that 800 metres as essentially an accessibility measure for the type of density proposed when you reduce the lot sizes and allow more people to live closer together. That creates more density, and to avoid creating congestion that would come with that, it's important that there are services and other transit options available to people within a walking distance. So that's the justification, and they've come up with 800 metres as the limit that they want to draw. So that's the justification they've provided in establishing that 800 metres.
Okay.
Thanks for your question, Arash.
Is it, sorry, can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Is there any reason that Willoughby South Town Centre excluded?
Again, so the state government considered centres, and they were the ones that chose what went in and went out. So I can't confirm with certainty. However, I can say, as I understand it, they were looking at the level of services available in different centres, and that includes both things like retail, post offices, bank, other services, supermarkets, just the sorts of shops and commercial activity in those centres, the amount in each centre, broadly speaking, as I understand it, as well as transit available. So bus services, walking distance from bus stops, the number of services, and train stations and the number of services and connectivity. So that came into their thinking when they selected the centres. They were also, as I understand it, mindful of keeping the number of centres selected to a level that can be handled at a wider regional level as well. So it wasn't simply centre by centre, it was also having a think about what they predicted the amount of housing would result from the changes, and whether that could be supported at a slightly larger regional scale as well. So again, I'm speaking as best I can for the rationale that the state government explained at the time. There may be other factors I'm not aware of, but certainly that's, as I understand it, the rationale for the centres they selected.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Kay, you have a question. If you unmute your mic, you should be able to ask us now.
Yep. Simple one. If a house is in a heritage conservation area and it meets the standards for non-refusal, is the developer able to knock down the house and say build townhouses, assuming they meet the state government criteria?
Again, as I mentioned, there are other criteria that also apply besides those non-refusal standards that would also need to be met before council would be willing or able to provide an approval. So no, it's not simply a matter of ticking the non-refusal standards only. It is the full, the application needs to be made against all the relevant standards and will be assessed against all the relevant standards.
So that includes the heritage standards, for example, around
Correct.
Retaining stuff. Okay, thanks.
Correct. Where they don't conflict with the non-refusal standards, we will apply the other heritage standards. And as I understand it, the legislation not just allows us, but requires that we assess applications against them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kay. All right, we'll go back to some of the text chat. We had Jacqueline ask, are dual locks allowed on battle axe blocks, i.e. 2.5 metre wide street frontage of driveway?
So if the only frontage is a 2.5 metre street frontage, no, they are not. You will require to meet the frontage requirements for the lot in question. And so if yours is a battle axe block and you don't have that frontage, then you will not meet those controls.
Thank you. Dr. Tony Richards asks, the presentation showed that flats in the R2 zoning can go to 9.5 metres height, but I've seen the limit described as 2 stories elsewhere. Any thoughts?
Yes, the legislation talks about both stories and heights in relation to the different forms. Where, again, so I'm going off our interpretation of this, and you will need to double check it because it can be quite technical and it does vary form by form. So it's important to double check. My understanding is the best sort of rule of thumb, but again, rule of thumb was to use the 9.5 as the one that explained the impact of those low-rise forms best. But yes, the intention is for it to remain 2-story development as well. And so in many cases, they've got both. And again, this gets back to, what I've said is a beginning. It's not the be all and end all, and there may be other controls. So as I understand it with the heights, where they refer to both heights and stories, both the heights and stories will apply as per the legislation. I've just been providing a summary. As you saw, those tables were already getting pretty full. There's only so much we wanted to pop into them. So yes, you will also need to have a look where both stories and heights are specified. You'll need to check the legislation because both might apply.
Right. Thank you. And Sunny asks, are we using the building line as the frontage like the SEP code, which I assume is the exempt and complying development code?
Good question. You're testing my memory. So again, I won't say with absolute certainty, but my best recollection is, yes, there is. It's not the lot line. So it's not the line at the edge of your lot. It is further back. And again, sorry, I can't recall the exact wording used, but where that frontage measurement is to be taken is specified in the legislation. And yes, it's not the exact lot line, so it's not the front edge of your lot. It's generally a bit further back. I think you may well be right that it's the building line, but again, apologies, I just can't remember the exact wording used for where that building line is to be calculated. It is in the legislation.
Ryan asks, has the policy mentioned anything about corner blocks, and will corner blocks be treated differently?
There is design guidance around corner blocks. There aren't separate sort of what I'm referring to as base controls, if you will. So those sort of lot sizes and heights, if I remember correctly, it's more around the sort of design guidance around corner blocks, where there are some additional design considerations available to corner blocks.
Another one from Sunny. Can we start submitting a DA for a dual lock if it falls within the 800 metres and it's in the R2 low density residential zone?
So this legislation has been made and gazetted. It is in force. So applications can be submitted. Again, I mentioned, it's not just those controls though, you will need to make sure you've looked at the other development control plans, the other design guides that are available to you to make sure you comply. And there'll be a whole range of technical documents in addition to the architectural plans that may be required to confirm, that you're providing the appropriate stormwater management, for example, against our DCP controls that might be in addition to any state legislation that's available. So all of that other information, that's just one example. There might be other things you need to provide. So yes, you can submit development applications. The legislation is in place, but generally speaking, it would presumably take a little bit of time to pull together the information confirming the controls that apply in your case and how you've addressed them.
Okay, I've got a hand raised. Oh, it's Rita. If you'd like to ask a further question, Rita, you can unmute.
Thank you. As the CBD grows, will the 800-metre affected areas also be extended?
So look, again, these are state government reforms. We didn't come up with the 800 metres or set it. This was a position taken by the state government. So I can't speak for whether they intend to review this further, expand it further over time. That's going to be a matter for the state government. What I would say is, as I mentioned, walking distances are the measure. And so you'll need to do that walking distance site by site. And as the CBD grows, it may be that crossing points change. It may be that through site links are delivered. And it may be that as development occurs, some of the ground conditions in these areas change that might change safe walkable routes. And that's one of the reasons why this is not something that's simply mapped and just set in stone. It's something that the state government chose to be part of applications. You'll need to have a look at what those walking distances are as they exist on the ground at the time your application's being made. But yes, that might change over time as safe walking routes evolve as development occurs. As for the rule, the 800-metre rule, that's a matter for the state government. I couldn't answer that one.
Okay, thanks.
And Dylan, if we were to say add a block of commercial zoning, north, south, east or west of Chatswood, that wouldn't necessarily impact the catchment, would it? Because it's mapped in the legislation.
Correct. So that centre line where for Northbridge and Chatswood is a line on a centres map that again is available on the state government spatial viewer. It looks to be reasonably reflected in the indicative map as well, but the source of truth is the department spatial viewer map. So they would need to change that map and amend that map for it to change. Again, if we were to simply approve a commercial development outside that map for a reason, it wouldn't automatically change it. The state government would have to consider whether they want to and change the map.
Okay. Thanks, Rita. I have a question now from Sam. You should be allowed to. You should be able to unmute now to ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we've got you, Sam.
Thanks, Mitchell. So in a heritage conservation area, houses have a certain frontal that you're supposed to keep as part of the heritage requirements. With duplexes, like if you're going to build side by side, it's kind of hard to maintain that frontal view, right? Especially when you're building two duplexes side by side, and it's 2 stories as well too. So what's the guidance around that? Like if we were to build a duplex, can we change the frontal to make that 2-story and make it duplex?
As I've said, the other controls apply. So, and I kind of alluded to this, there are a range of locations and sites where, in my view, and again, this is my view, it's going to be very difficult to provide an approvable application for some of these forms, given the controls that are around heritage conservation areas, which are in place to protect areas that the community values and the character therein. I can't rule it out. There are some extremely talented architects out there, and lots vary and the conditions vary. The extent to which a particular property contributes to a conservation area might vary. So there's no simple answer I can provide. That's something that each owner or applicant will need to consider. However, as I've mentioned, in my view, where you have perhaps as a general example, a highly contributory original building from the subdivision where the conservation area first occurred. It's a highly contributory building. It's going to be very hard to justify a demolition in that case, given the controls, the prevailing controls seek retention of significant items. So whether it's possible to use these reforms to deliver some sort of redevelopment, maintaining enough of the existing building to allow us to approve the application and manage that heritage streetscape, that's a live question, and it would vary. The answer to that would vary depending on the building, the streetscape in question, and the DCP that you're referring to, because the conservation area DCPs do vary slightly. Apologies, I can't provide a more specific answer, but hopefully that provides some guidance.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. We have another Sam with a question here. Sam, if you'd like to unmute.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Some of the streets within 400 meters walking distance from the town center and the station, they used to be R2 zoning, but they were rezoned from R2 to R3 just 1 year ago by the Willoughby Council to allow 3-story townhouses. And some of those streets, they are very narrow, and the street parkings are always occupied. And with the street parking occupied, it's really hard to drive on the street because the street is very narrow. So it just doesn't make sense to build 6-story or 7-story apartments in these kind of narrow streets. So when the council received the DA from developers, will the council consider all these factors to determine whether it's approved or not?
So the width of the street on which it's located is not a control that we have specifically. However, we will consider the parking requirements and the requirements that we have in our development control plans and in the state legislation. Depending on the type of development, it might apply its own controls for parking, or it might refer to council's controls. So there are requirements embedded in the legislation and in council's controls that require off-street parking for certain levels to try to mitigate the on-street impacts. However, the street width in and of itself would not be enough for council to be refusing applications. It would need to be non-compliant with a whole range of other and have a whole bunch of other issues. Look, I think the issue you raise is a reasonable one. It's something council mentioned in its submission, and this is the difficulty with applying statewide legislation with sort of a blanket radius listing a whole range of centres. Not every centre is created equal. The local road patterns might vary slightly, and that's why previously, when it's been left to councils to determine permissibility, they've done so by targeting locations and using our zones to target in and limit the heights to try to manage those local scenarios. Unfortunately, though, there is a serious housing crisis that we're facing, and the state government's approach has been to try to release more capacity as a matter of urgency, and they've chosen to do it in this way, which means we no longer have that luxury of that finer grain refusal of applications or trying to shepherd applications block by block. So the short answer is, in and of itself, no. Like a smaller, thinner road that a property fronts to, the road width in and of itself isn't enough to knock these applications out. If it can satisfy the other controls, it may still be approved. despite the fact that that might impact the number of people using what is a narrow street.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have some further questions, the Q&A tab, and I'll just come back to those. Tina had a question, and this is a two-part question. In the New South Wales low and mid-rise housing policy, stage 2, there are only 2 categories of houses in the heritage conservation areas, heritage items and others. Why does Council apply more controls to contributory items in HCAs? It should be overridden by the New South Wales policy.
Okay, so on that question, in the heritage conservation areas, we do identify the contributory items. We also do, if I remember correctly, identify neutral items and other items that may be less consistent. With Council's DCP controls, they're set at trying to manage change and development in a way that maintains the things that the community values about those locations. That might vary location to location. That's why council DCPs that apply in conservation areas also vary. It's not the same DCP that applies to every HCA, and different councils treat those controls slightly differently as well. As to the view that it should be completely overridden by the policy, look, there's varied opinion about the heritage conservation areas and what should and shouldn't be done. All I can say is that the reforms as they've been applied do apply some overriding of the restrictions, but defer to the controls in other areas, and that's the situation we find ourselves in. So we'll be assessing applications against the legislation as it is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dylan. And the second part is, when will design guidance be updated? It seems the latest Willoughby Development Control Plan was published in October 2023.
Yes, so Council does do updates to its Development Control Plan iteratively over time. We currently have some minor changes to the DCP. They are limited to sort of corrections rather than anything substantial that I believe went on exhibition this week and are currently on exhibition, but they are not wide-ranging changes that relate to this reform or any other major changes. As I mentioned, they're far more minor in nature. When will we be doing more updates and more wide-ranging updates? As I mentioned, the Development Control Plan is quite a large document. It's not a small piece of work to review and update. It does take quite significant time and resources. And our program currently is to look at reviewing the Development Control Plan over the next 18 to 24 months, so probably more in the mid timescale rather than in the immediate short term. Part of that is that we have a number of other matters that we need to address that are still in train, and working through our program, making sure we can do things effectively and efficiently. At the moment, we're particularly focusing and looking and making the changes we need to reduce development assessment times. For example, we have a number of other projects where we're progressing and sort of in the middle of. Once those have progressed, we will then have a look at reviewing the Development Control Plan. The other element to this is it will allow us to monitor how these reforms actually hit the ground and where there might be challenges. We do monitor and keep track of issues that arise through the development application process. We keep an eye on court cases, both as they apply to developments in Willoughby as well as in Sydney more generally. So how controls are being interpreted, not just by applicants, but also by the courts, is important to us, and we keep an eye on that. And where necessary, we can make iterative changes to the DCP. However, given the amount of reform that's occurred over the last few months, it's likely that we do need to do quite a significant review sort of take stock of how all of these reforms are putting pressure on the DCP and what changes we might need to make. But as I said, that's not something that will happen immediately. It's not a project that's currently funded or budgeted in the current financial year. It's something we'd look at in future years.
Thanks, Alan. And thank you, Tina, for your questions. And Lucy has a question. She says, does that mean if it's outside of 800 metres in the R2 zone, you still need to apply to do a dual occupancy if council's rule is you need 700 square metres to do that and larger than 15 metres frontage?
Yes, so my interpretation of the legislation as it stands is if you are outside that 800 metre radius, but you are in an R2 zoned location, council's duplex controls are the prevailing duplex controls, being council's minimum lot size and council's minimum frontage, which for duplexes, 700 square metres for an attached duplex, 900 square metres for a detached duplex, and a minimum frontage of 15 metres.
Excellent. And Jan Wren asks, can the lowest bushfire risk zone apply dual occupancy? I think that is, can you do a dual lock in the bushfire risk zone that is the lowest?
Apologies, I can't recall how the bushfire zones are worded, but I can say there is provision in the legislation stating that the reforms don't apply on a certain level of bushfire rating. So there is a bushfire risk rating in the legislation, after which you cannot use the reform controls. Apologies, I don't know the risk level off the top of my head, but it is specified in the legislation under the exemption section.
Lucy asks regarding dual locks in conservation areas in the R2 zone, can it be done via a CDC or must it be a DA?
Sorry, can you repeat the first part, Mitch?
It's regarding dual occupancies in conservation zones.
Okay, dual occupancies in conservation zones in the R2.
Yes.
So well, actually, the simple answer, I guess, the simpler answer is the reforms do not change what you can do as complying development. So the reforms simply change what you can do with a development application to council. So the short answer is, if you couldn't do a CDC, if you couldn't do a complying development before, you can't do one now. The reforms haven't expanded the complying development pathway. For those of you on the call who might not be familiar with CDC or complying development as a term, these are developments where you don't need to make an application to a council. You can make an application to a professional called a private certifier who can approve an application for certain types of development without the need for a full DA. These reforms do not expand that pathway. These reforms only refer to applications where a development application is required.
Understood. Thanks, Darren. I'm going to go back to live questions now. One for Lucy, then Tony, then Dominic and Judith Tamas. We will start with Lucy. If you unmute yourself, you'll be able to ask a question now. How's that going, Lucy? You should be right to ask now. I can see you're unmuted. Okay, we might come back to you, Lucy. Just hold one moment. Dr. Tony Richards, would you like to ask a question? Tony, if you unmute, you should be right to. There you go. Yep.
Yeah. Good. I presume the state government either has set targets or will set targets for Willoughby City. Do you have any sense as to whether or not all the state government changes, plus the Willoughby Council's pre-existing LEP, will make achievement of those targets feasible economically?
I think the crucial part of your question is the last part, feasible economically, in terms of simple development capacity. So, is there sufficient undeveloped land or underdeveloped land with the current zoning and permissibility to meet the housing targets? Yes, there's enough land that is zoned to allow new development that would allow more than enough homes to meet the housing target. But as I mentioned, the last part of your question is the really crucial one. Will it become economically feasible? That's a harder question to answer, and there's a number of reasons for that. On the one hand, that feasibility question pertains to land values and the profit margins that are required for a lot owner, a landowner, or a developer to invest in redeveloping their property. And that's going to vary place to place. In Willoughby, land values are relatively high compared to other areas of Sydney. And so some of these reforms might not make economic sense in all locations. The other element to this is also, there's only so much construction activity that can be sustained by the industry as it operates currently in New South Wales, at least in the short term. And that's another consideration. These reforms apply statewide. And so there's going to be development that is now possible all over Sydney, but the reforms haven't in and of themselves changed the number of developers available to do it. So where those developers choose to operate remains to be seen, but one of the assumptions that you might make in that regard is that they're going to be drawn to those areas where the profit margins are largest. And as I mentioned in Willoughby's case, that is impacted somewhat by the high cost of land in general. Now, that's not to say that developments are completely unfeasible here. It's simply to say that by comparison, the amount of take-up might be different in Willoughby. And as Mitch mentioned earlier, we don't anticipate that this reform is like flicking a switch and we're going to see whole streets change very rapidly. We think given the amount of construction resources available to the city currently, given the cost of land in Willoughby and given the development profile that we've seen and the type of applications that we see are in demand by both existing residents and developers operating in the area, there will be some take-up of these reforms, but it's not going to be complete take-up in a very rapid way. We think it will come online slowly over time. For a more rapid take-up to occur, there'd need to be some other changes that speak to some of those other key constraints, land values and construction capacity, not just zoning.
Thank you. And we'll try Lucy again. Lucy, do you want to have a crack and see if you can unmute and ask your question?
Yes. Sorry
Hey,
for
Lucy.
sorry.
All good.
Sorry, English is my second language, so I lost while you're speaking. And can I ask again, what's the reason why state website says dual occupancy 400 square meters, 12 frontage applies statewide, not only within low and mid-rise house area, but Willoughby Council says it must be 800 meters walking distance.
So
Thank you.
My understanding, and again, you'll need to get your own advice to be absolutely sure. We've done our best to interpret it, but my understanding is in the R2 zones outside the 800-metre radius, where council has a minimum lot size, that minimum lot size, and where council has a minimum frontage, council's minimum frontage remains the control. Where in the R2 zone, council permits duplexes, but they don't have a minimum lot size, that's where the state government reforms come into play. But because in Willoughby's case, we have a minimum lot size. Again, this is just my best understanding, and I'm open to be corrected on that. You know, should you get your own advice and your planner be adamant that I've misinterpreted the legislation, you know, you will be able to put that into the application and refer to the legislation you're referring to. But my interpretation of the legislation as it applies outside the 800 metre areas is that it picks up council's minimum lot sizes where there is a minimum lot size. And in Willoughby's case, we have one, and same with the frontage.
Thanks, Darlan. Thanks, Lucy. Now to Dominic and Judith Tamas. If you'd like to ask your question and unmute. Are you there, Dominic and Judith? I come back. We'll go back to our Q&As. Thank you for your patience, those of you who've posted in the chat. We will go for another 8 minutes till 7:30, so we'll try and speed through these last group. What do we have here? Carl, to where is the height measured? The ridge of the roof or the ceiling height?
So the height is a built form envelope. So it's not the ceiling height; it is the ridge height, the height of the building.
Excellent. And it sounds like we've got Dominic and Judith unmuted. Do you want to fire away with your question, please?
If the property is currently in C4 zone within 800 meters from the shopping centre, will the C4 zone be changed to R2?
No. So these reforms do not apply in the C4 zone.
Oh, okay. Okay, and then we've got, how are local flood analysis considered? Further question from Carl. Do you get that one, Darlan?
Sorry, I missed that one.
Oh, good. Carl asks, how is local flood studies and analysis considered?
Okay, so there is not a blanket exemption for flood affected or flood risk land. It's something that needs to be addressed through the application process. So if you are in a flood affected lot, so you might be on a flow path, you might be affected in a 1 in 100 event, you might be in the probable maximum flood area, for example. So there are different measures of flood affectation and flood risk, and there are different levels of flow and impact associated with that. That's something we will need to assess as part of your application, and we will require applications in those areas to address our DCP controls that relate to stormwater impact, that relate to flood mitigation and flood management. So as part of your application, you'll need to demonstrate that you're addressing the flood risk, and that might impact things like the floor levels on your property, on your proposal, and and how high you put the floor. It might affect the ability for the property to be developed for this sort of development. So that's something you'll need to look at as a site constraint for those individual sites. And that's where another reason why I say, simply because you meet the discretionary standards and the non-discretionary standards that I've summarised here tonight, that doesn't necessarily mean an approval is coming. There are a whole bunch of other constraints and other controls that will need to be assessed as part of a development application. Flooding is one of those. So we will need to look at the flood risk, and we'll need to make sure any of these proposals in flood areas are managing that risk, not just for their site, but making sure that any impact to surrounding sites and the overall flow path is appropriately managed and within acceptable ranges.
Thank you. Moving along, we've got 5 minutes left. Aaron asks, Where can we find out which property is a contributory or non-contributory item in the Willoughby conservation areas?
So there is not a simple published list in that regard, and that's something we would look at as part of perhaps a future DCP update. So how do we know? How do you know if an item's contributory or not contributory? I alluded to this previously. Generally speaking, the contributory items are those items or those buildings that were built when the original subdivision was released for the conservation area as it's made. Generally, our conservation areas in Willoughby are areas that were subdivided and developed as part of the subdivision as Sydney grew. There were sort of land release areas where perhaps more familiar with those land releases in Western Sydney more recently, but over the years, that was the way things were developed in inner Sydney as well, and in areas like Willoughby, and where you've got areas where there was a sort of large subdivision, a lot of development happened at once, and over the years, the community, as it built up around those areas, came to value that character. They'd come in and say to council, look, we'd like to see that a conservation area, or council officers in the past may have said this is something valuable based on the legislation as exists around heritage, and we should seek to protect it. And council sought to do that through its LEP, and they're now in place. So the seed or the reason a heritage conservation area is a heritage conservation area is generally in Willoughby because a whole area was developed in a certain way, and we wanted to protect that way. If your item, if your building is consistent and undertaken at the time that subdivision was made and is highly consistent with the streetscape and relatively intact, then it's likely to be a contributory item. If you're unsure, we do have a duty officer available, and he has access to our heritage advisor, or you're more than welcome to email council, and we'd pass on that request into our heritage advisor, who can confirm for you whether or not your item is a contributory item in a conservation area. But as I said, as a rule of thumb, if it's a building that was more recently developed, and you can have development in heritage conservation areas. As I mentioned, the conservation areas weren't conservation areas when they were first developed. They were things implemented later. So in the intervening years, there would have been change, and a number of buildings would have changed before it became a conservation area, but after the first buildings were built in that area, and those buildings are unlikely to be contributory items. So that's the rule of thumb. But there isn't currently a published list as such. It's something that our heritage advisor can help you with.
Thank you. And I've got a couple of more questions for our final 2 minutes. Can private certifiers assess subdivisions once council has approved the dual occupancies or residential flat buildings, or is a separate application required?
So again, the things that a private certifier can assess has not changed. There are circumstances in which subdivisions can be approved by a certifier. I don't have the time tonight to go through all of those with you, and I don't know them off the top of my head. But there are provisions that allow complying development subdivisions, and those are still in place. They don't apply everywhere though. So in some instances, you'd need to have a look at whether it's approvable through the development pathway, the development application pathway.
Where does affordable housing fit into these reforms? Do they overrule council's affordable housing requirements?
So another good question. They don't overrule council's affordable housing requirements. However, the areas affected are generally separate to those locations where council has affordable housing requirements, but not entirely necessarily. So where council has affordable housing requirements, they are still in place. The other way that these reforms interact with affordable housing legislation, Mitch mentioned right up the top that there's a whole bunch of other legislation that's also been happening. One of those is the infill affordable housing state policy, and that allows bonuses for certain developments. Those bonuses can apply for flat buildings in these developments potentially as well. So where a applicant is providing a specified level of affordable housing in a specified form, that's all in that infill affordable housing SEP, they are allowed to seek variations to the height and floor spaces, and that legislation applies on top of these reforms potentially in some circumstances. So there's a couple of interactions there whereby the affordable housing legislation that exists, it's not switched off by this legislation, it runs in parallel.
Brilliant. Okay, we are now at 7:30. I just want to say thank you so much, Darlin, for the great information you've provided this evening, and thank you so much to our audience who have asked some fantastic questions. Really appreciate your feedback and your thoughts on this new legislation. We hope here at Willoughby Council that you've gained a better understanding of the reforms and now have a bit more grasp on what it means for you and for us. We are going to be putting some information up on our website. The presentation that we presented to you tonight is already on the website. Once we download the recording of this evening, we will put it up online, I would say within a couple of days, to help those who have similar questions to you. So we appreciate you asking them. On behalf of Willoughby Council, thank you very much and good evening.